Hello and welcome to the Mardi Gras Film Festival. My name's Mon Schafter. I'm an ABC journalist and the content lead of ABCQueer, and I'm your host for today's panel about inclusive casting. Before we get into it, I'd like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the traditional custodians of this land, and pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and pay my respects to the elders, the land, on wherever you're watching from today. When we say inclusive casting, we're talking about things like casting actors of colour, actors with disabilities, queer people, trans and gender non-conforming actors, and other members of historically and currently marginalised communities that are not well represented or are misrepresented on stage and on screen. And to help us explore this topic, I'd like to introduce our guests. Up first, we have Lucky Price, a casting director and proud trans man and advocate for trans rights. Hey, Lucky.
Hello, how are you?
Good, thank you. Also joining us is writer and comedian Alistair Baldwin, who has written for the ABC's The Weekly, Hard Quiz and Get Krack. Hey, Alistair.
Hi there.
Hey. And also we have Bee Cruse, who's a proud Gomeroi, Wiradjuri and Monaroo-Yuin Storyteller. She works as a writer, director, producer in film, TV and theatre, and regularly takes on acting and drag king roles in her spare time, including last night, Bee. I saw you at Butch at the Town Hall, opening night of Mardi Gras.
Yes. So, yeah, Thanks made an appearance. It was very fun.
Excellent. And you didn't party too hard, did you? Because you're with us here at 11 a.m. in the morning, which is we appreciate that.
I was responsible.
Excellent. Good on you. So was I. So conversations around authentic and inclusive casting have been big news in the past few months, both in Australia and around the world, mostly when a production gets it really wrong, but also thankfully because of progress that's being made in this space by production companies and commissioning bodies. I might add that if you're watching, online all around the country, and if you have a comment or a question, feel free to pop it in, and I'll do my best to get to all of those as we go through our chat today. To start off with, I might give an example, if that's okay. Sia's film Music, which is a musical about a young autistic woman and features autism as a running plot point. And Sia, as the director, has copped a lot of criticism for its inauthentic depiction of neurodiversity. How did she get this so wrong? Alistair, maybe I'll start with you on this one and I'll go through everyone.
Absolutely. Well, I think with disability identity, there's so many able people who still see it as an identity of comparison. It's something which has happened to a normal person and they've gone a bit wrong. And so I think able people still feel like they have this ability to represent disability by casting abled actors, in this case Maddie Ziegler, who Sia herself, after she was criticised for inauthentic casting, she said she casted Maddie because of nepotism, because she was like, nepotism is a less cancelable offence than ableism. But I think one of the arguments she made was that it would be cruel to cast an actually authentic autistic person in the role, which is so condescending and belittling, because there are autistic actors that are out there who really could have added a level of authenticity to the role, because there are so many iterations of criticism of the film Music, but most recently was the sort of portrayal of restraints when the autistic character was having a meltdown, which is considered widely in the autistic community as a form of torture and very uncomfortable. And it's painted, to my understanding, in a relatively positive way or a helpful way. And I think when you're only working with, an abled cast and an abled director and writer, you do have these complete blind spots that are, leave yourself open to poor representation.
Lucky, I might ask you, you're a casting director. In situations like this, whose responsibility is it to get it right?
It's everybody's responsibility to get it right. Certainly, there are so many levels of To approach this, there are so many levels to look at how you put a production together. Who's telling the story? Who are we seeing for the roles? What are the parameters? What are the skill set required? But in talking about skill set, I think it's really important to highlight that disability is not a skill. It's a part of people's identity. Color is not a skill. It's a part of our identity. Our gender is not a skill. It's a part of our identity. So the idea that you can, I mean, I don't understand how an actor would have on their bio, one of my skills is that I can play an autistic person, or someone of autistic experience. I don't understand where that is a skill set. And I think that, you know, it's the role of everybody to make sure that we're telling stories authentically. And have we been good at it? No, we haven't. And is it hard? Is it harder? Yes, it is, because until there is some sense of equal visibility, it's going to be really, it's a challenge to find people who will put their hands up to play roles if you're not seeing yourself represented on stage or on screen.
Cool, thanks for that. Bee, we've seen, you know, examples of inauthentic casting in the past and films that have won Academy Awards, and whether it's inauthentic casting of people with disability or different cultural backgrounds, you know, transgender people. Why do you think we're just starting to take this issue really seriously now?
I think it's just a vital importance. You know, there's enough of us, there's enough diverse people and non-white people out there in the world who work in the arts. Like, I've got so many friends who are queer actors. You know, I've got a few trans friends and black fellows and white fellows who are in the arts. But without all of us coming together, like you said, it's everybody's responsibility. I don't know. I'm still pushing for it. I want to see black actors. I want to see black fellas. You know, I'm sick of seeing just the main white stream telling all these other stories, like putting their nose in business that they shouldn't be putting their nose into. You know, it's like,
yeah.
I don't know. That's just my opinion. I'm tired of people coming in and like stealing our Indigenous stories, for example. That's where I'm coming from, I guess. Like, there's so many white production companies that think that they're right and their way is correct. It's like, no, my people have been telling stories for thousands of years. I am a storyteller. That's my cultural right. You know, I'm not just a filmmaker. I have a cultural responsibility to my land, my people. You know, and to tell these stories that I do. That's to be that. I don't know. Maybe that radical person that can say, hey, you know, if you're a white fella production company, why are you telling black fella stories? Or why is the top black fella production company, why is that run by white fellas, you know? Why is that? I don't know the answer, but I'm just like, something needs to change in that.
Well, it's 100%. Interesting, Bee, too, because you're talking about this idea of being radical by hoping or expecting something that's actually incredibly normal, which is the right to tell your own stories. Like, you know, so the simple notion that that's a radical idea is just still makes my mind explode. You know, the natural born right we have to tell our own stories with our own bodies. And the fact that we have to fight for that space, you know, amongst an industry that is dominated and the storytelling has been dominated by cis white men, and that's the reality of what that is. And you know, that there's enough of the cake to go around for everyone. There's enough for us to share in and all have an ability to tell our stories without threatening anyone else's storytelling.
Yeah.
Totally. Fortunately, we've had some new commissioning guidelines announced just this last week that will hopefully help on this front. I might come back to that in a little bit. Before I do, Alistair, you're writing your final thesis on disability representation on Australian screens. How are we performing generally in this space?
Oh, yeah. So this was my screenwriting honours thesis. I actually completed that a few years ago now. But in essence, this was based on the Seeing Ourselves Screen Australia audit of diversity that was released a couple of years ago. And in terms of disability, it was over 90% of, I mean, to start off with, the number of disabled characters was small. That feels expected. But what was really interesting to me was that over 90% were portrayed by abled actors. And then within that, 73% of all disabled representation occurred on Home and Away and Neighbours. And that was inclusive of what I call SOAP disabilities, which are disabilities which are sort of brought up and then discarded within the space of 6 weeks. I'm talking about amnesia. I'm talking about learning to walk again after a boating accident. I'm talking about being hit over the head because your evil twin wants to sleep with your husband. Like, there are all of these. I think disability is interesting because for a lot of people, they're using it as a dramatic thing which happens to an abled person. They're using it as a trauma. And what that necessitates is casting an abled actor so that you can see the dramatic arc of what disability does to someone. So when disability is conceived as like a plot point, that actually impacts casting decisions, rather than when disability is seen as an identity, then you start from a place of disability, meaning you can start from actually casting authentically.
Are there, can you give us some good examples? So when casting directors or when productions have gotten it right?
Absolutely. Well, I think a really wonderful initiative that happened recently was ABC's Disrupt initiative, which was done, maybe it was 2 years ago now, for International Day of People with Disability, where there were 3 essentially short films commissioned, which had to have like a lead disabled creative and casting authenticity in that. And there was a wonderful production by Eliza Hull, who I know and have worked with, and she's a wonderful, proud disabled woman, which had a young disabled lead. And I think, I don't know, I have a soft spot for casting authenticity, specifically in children's TV, because I think growing up as like a kid in leg braces, I just never saw that. And in a society which medicalizes your identity, i.e. it says that it's something that is wrong and ideally will be cured, I think authenticity in that way is so important, to let your brain conceive of disability identity outside of a problem and as something which either can just be, or indeed is, an asset and a really enriching part of the way that you experience the world.
What would authentic representation have meant to you as a young person?
I think it would have been really helpful. I mean, I have a mild Titan-related muscular dystrophy, and so I would go through periods of not wearing my leg braces in school, especially when I got to high school, where, I mean, now, I'm bleaching my hair and dyeing it pink and whatever, but I think in high school, anything which makes you different and sets you out is sort of, you feel a lot of shame attached to that. And so there would be times where I would prioritize appearing normal, but by not wearing my leg braces, that was the more disabling thing, because I wouldn't be able to walk as much and I would be in more pain. But I think that's the thing with representation, is that in a shame-based society, it's better to appear normal than to feel your best. But if we lived in a world where there was more disability representation growing up, I think it wouldn't have felt like something that I had to hide to feel part of a normal community, which disability is just part of human biodiversity.
Thank you so much for that. I might give another example now. We recently saw the Sydney Festival cancel or postpone their production of Hedwig and the Angry Inn after a backlash at the casting of Hugh Sheridan in the title role. And Hugh, who we've seen in shows like Packed to the Rafters, is a cis man, and the character of Hedwig is gender diverse, even though the writer John Cameron Mitchell says it's not a typical trans story. Lucky, I'd love your thoughts on this one. Why should trans and gender diverse roles be played by people with that experience?
I mean, it speaks to the point that I was making before, but the importance of you know, humans to have a space to tell their own stories, and whilst that particular role might not specifically, or has been articulated by the writers not to specifically speak to necessarily a particular transgender experience, the reality is, I think that the opportunity for transgender people to occupy those spaces, I mean, let's be honest, how many roles exist, you know, as we're talking about sort of humans with disability? I mean, the amount of roles that exist in that space are so limited. Equally so for people of transgender or gender diverse experience, it's a very limited pool of roles. And simply for people not to even be seen to have the opportunity to play those roles is, it's something now that really needs to start changing. And I think the incredible effect by a group of people who did get together to protest that decision making and actually saw that whole production cancelled is quite remarkable. And I think that, you know, the experience that I know certainly that Hugh went through that from that. I mean, there's so much complication around that, and probably the politics of it, you know, the elements of it that I don't really want to get into, but I know that his own experience of coming out recently, and that he likened that experience to that of the character's gender diversity, is complicated. You know, it's also not necessarily the space or a role for a gay cis man to tell that story. You know, it's appropriation, and I think that you know, the more opportunities we get to tell our own stories, the better.
I imagine there was a lot of learning that has taken place from a lot of people associated with that production.
I think so, and I think there's that, you know, there's a space too where, you know, there's so much good intention, and there are production companies and people in those spaces, and certainly people who wish to be allies to, you know, everyone of different experience, who just aren't very good at it, who aren't very good at finding language or common ground, or, you know, well, we tried to do the right thing by putting this play on and creating a space, and we found a person who sits outside a normative structure, and is that good enough? Is that space good enough? They can tell the story. Well, it's not good enough. I understand it's well-meaning, but it's not good enough.
I recently watched Disclosure, Laverne Cox's Netflix documentary on trans representation, and I learned so much in watching that.
I haven't watched it yet. Oh no. Yeah.
Right. No, that's okay. But there was a point that's made in the doco about the link between cis men playing trans women in roles and the amount of violence perpetuated against trans women in society. And the point was that it's reinforcing this transphobic belief that trans people are performers or tricksters, as opposed to it being an authentic lived experience. And that was the link. Did anyone else see the doco?
I did. It was fantastic.
Yeah, I can't wait. Yeah, it's on the must list. But it's precisely that, the problematic nature of this idea of cisgendered people telling the story of transgender people perpetuates that idea that transgender people are just people dressing up in someone else's clothing. You know, they're dressing up in the opposite gender's clothing, and you know, and that also tells another experience of like, you know, a transsexual experience, or that there are other identity expressions in that space as well. But it does perpetuate that idea that this is dress ups. And as you said, it's an identity, you know, and telling those stories in that simplistic way, and how that does perpetuate violence, and the real effect of that in the community is astounding.
Did the representation of trans people on screen have any impact on your experience growing up, Lucky?
Hell yeah. Where were they? I only transitioned my gender at the tender age of 35, which was 5 years ago. And I spent my lifetime working out where I fit in, and I never fit in. And I didn't even know that this existed. I didn't know that I could do this. I didn't know that I had a place in the world, really. And that has been, particularly with, not particularly, that's not fair, but the transgender men can be invisible. And, you know, testosterone is a powerful thing. And as far as the hormone works and the physical effect that it has on bodies, but the space to tell the stories of transgender men. I've never seen transgender men in media or on screen. Certainly growing up, I didn't understand it. So, you know, it was only that when I started finding people who were outside of my community, I didn't have a lot of transgender friends. It was only that as I started meeting people outside of the community that my body and mind began to register that this is something that I could be in the world, you know. So had that been a part of the way I understand media, or had that been a part of something that I could turn on the screen and see in a positive, reinforced way that wasn't a marginalized way, you know, telling stories in complex ways that are layered and full of nuance in the way and the privileged way that many stories are told in our country and other countries of, you know, of white, cis, straight experience, the complexity of those stories. You know, that is something that marginalized communities have not been afforded. So, you know, if I was going to be trans, maybe I was only ever going to be trans in this particular way, and it was scary and horrifying because it led to violence, it led to marginalization and ostracization. You know, so yes, it would have made a big difference in my life.
Thanks, Lucky. And thanks also for everyone who's commenting. I'm seeing those flashing up on screen, and we really appreciate you being part of the conversation. There's also the issue of whitewashing when racially diverse characters are rewritten so white people can play them, and also race-blind casting when white people are cast in culturally diverse roles at the expense of people from those cultures. And you could say that Ben Affleck and Claire Duvall in Argo are guilty here. The CIA officer Affleck's character is based on his half Mexican and Duvall's is Japanese American. Bee, as someone who works across film, TV and theatre, how are you seeing cultural diversity depicted in storytelling these days? Are things changing?
Things are definitely changing. Like, people have more of an awareness these days. You know, like, we're calling it authentic and inclusive casting in this panel. And I think to be able to do it right, you yourself need to be authentic. If you're portraying somebody who's outside your own little box, or whatever you want to call it, you know, take the time to get to know that community. Don't just rock up and say, hey, I've got this character. You're a black fella. Can you have a read of it for me? You know, I'm sick of that. It's like, take the time to create your script and find the right black fellas to help you with that script, you know. Don't just tag it at the end. And it's the same with, I see it with producers, I see it with production companies still too today. Last year I actually left a couple of different companies and jobs just because I was the only black fella in the company. And when I started talking about Indigenous protocols, they were like, oh, shit, that's something we have to do.
Wow.
Like, yes, that is something you have to do. If you are creating content in Australia that involves Indigenous people or not, you have to have an awareness. This is our country. If you're going into, you know, the bungle bungles or whatever and filming, you need to get permission from some black fellas up that way. You know, it's like treading into somebody else's house without permission. It's just take the time, build those genuine, authentic relationships. And, you know, I think that's the way forward, is speaking about it more. The fact that we get to speak here, like I'm a black queer human, you know, but I don't necessarily always want to play black queer roles. You know, I want to play a doctor or something, or like, I don't know, the astronaut, or in the next Apollo movie, or I don't know. But it's like, I don't want to be typecast into that shit either. So to me, there's a fine line between, like, I don't know, like an appreciation of culture and somebody else's circumstances, and then there's appropriation. How much can I take and put into my work and call them my own? Like what Sia did. Like, what was she thinking? I'm not even ticking that box, and I'm like, girl, you crazy.
Yeah.
The thing that's astounding about that with Sia is, like, can you imagine the number of hands and minds and people that like, how many signatures had to go on pieces of paper to make that happen? And all of those people thought it was okay. Like, it's astounding. Like, and B, you know, like, why isn't a doctor role a queer woman, a black woman's role? Like, why is that you stepping outside of a box? Like, what? Surely there are queer black doctors. Like, you know, this exists. And I know the irony is that I'm the bloody casting director in the room, you know, and it is, and it is. It's totally my fault on behalf of all the casting directors of the world. I single-handedly take responsibility. But what I will say is that it's, oh man, I find it equally frustrating, you know, and it really depends on what productions I'm working on. You know, I spend a lot of time working in, sorry, Mon, I'll stop talking. I spend a lot of time working with major networks on very commercial television, and man, it's hard, you know. But it's hard to change minds, and it's absurd even the thought that you have to say the language change minds. But you know, there is perception. There are people out there who have been doing their jobs for a long time, and man, it's like getting the dinosaurs to wake up from the ice age, and you know, you have to take the wins where you can. Yes, I understand. You know, I'm very proud to be a transgender man who's sitting in those boardroom meetings, because that's a space that we've never been able to occupy before. But you know, like, it's the time. It's just actually not good enough anymore. And I know I keep saying that it's a boring old line to say, but it's not good enough anymore. And trying is not good enough. Doing is what has to happen now. Mm-hmm. You know, and maybe that means compromising. Maybe there is compromise, but you know what? There has to be compromise. You know?
Yeah, man.
Yeah.
There's also the issue of recognition as well, like people who are doing good work not being, you know, applauded for the amazing stuff that's out there. We've had the Oscars So White backlash, and we've recently seen I Made a Story, Michaela Cole's acclaimed series about consent, being shut out of the Golden Globes. Why aren't people of colour getting the credit they deserve in these examples?
Because the world is run by like white cis males. That's why. All the bloody structures that they've set up. There's no place for anybody who's a non-white cis male. And I'm not going to swear again. It's just stupid. It is stupid. You know, there's so many like different colors and shades and walks and struts and whatever, you know, diversity and stuff in so many avenues of our society. And in Australia, we're so multicultural, but we're still stuck in this white structured crap. And I don't know, I'm trying to get out of the bloody gunk. That's why that's why I love this kind of space. You know, I feel like I can be myself for a minute and not be like, hey, she's that black radical. Let's go over this bloke who's bloody crazy. It's like, mate, have a conversation, please. Let's sit down and talk.
100%. Where are we here?
There's a great you guys have probably all seen Joey Soloway's 2016 TIFF address. There's this lovely sort of manifesto that went for an hour and was talking about the female gaze, and I implore everyone to watch that amazing talk, because you know, it's exactly to what Bee was speaking to, this idea of the male gaze and the fact that the construct of you know, screen, of film, and the whole way that it is constructed is literally designed by cis males. And you know, and the difficulty now in infiltrating that space to tell different stories, because the construct has been made by white cis men, you know. So even the feeling of how we tell stories, you know, using that space is really difficult. You know, it's almost having to reinvent the whole way we approach storytelling.
Totally. Laura has. Oh, sorry, Bea, you go.
No, just agreeing with what Lucky was saying. I think it's problematic in that, you know, not having a safe space to tell stories. You know, I am a storyteller, but I've been on so many white fella productions, and I've met producers that ask me, oh, can we get someone a little bit more blacker at the front? You know, I'm like, what does that even mean to me, you know? And that's someone's lack of understanding of what and who black fellas are. You know, I get it as a queer woman. It's like, oh, can you just, you know, can you gay it up a bit? Can you look a bit butch or whatever? Queer women are very sexualized in screen media. I'm like, I ain't a little minx. I've got a wife, you know, I've got a dog, I've got a house. I'm trying to be a good girl. Don't portray me and who I am to be someone that I'm not, you know? And I think that's coming from that white, you know, cis kind of spectrum of who we are as people. They're like, oh, let's make those lesbians look sexy. Let's make them black fellas look real black. And it's like, no, can you let us tell our stories for a minute the way that we want to tell them?
Mm. When it comes to casting, is there a grey area? Like, are there exceptions to the rule when it comes to authentic casting? Like, we see a lot of straight actors playing queer roles. Is that ever okay?
I personally think it's a bit, in these days, if you represent a community, you need that community's approval. Like, I'm a black queer woman, you know, I'm an able woman. So in my moral thoughts, I wouldn't take on an acting role that was someone with a disability, you know, because that's just the way that I am. If there was a specific character coming from like a lighter background or something, I don't know how I would do it because I've got very dark skin. But, you know, if someone asked me to play a white fella, I wouldn't feel comfortable with that. But that's just who I am. Whereas I know plenty of white, you know, cis male people who turn around and be like, yeah, I'll play that, you know, I'll play that Mexican dude, even though he's like, you know, not Mexican at all. I'll play that, you know, that blind fella. It's like, have you even hung out with a blind person before? I don't know. I think there is a grey area. There's some do's and some don'ts. But actors are actors, you know, we're made to portray something other than ourselves. And I get that argument. But in these days, if you represent somebody else's community, you need their permission. Yeah.
And I also think we need to ask questions, you know, it has to be, yes, grey area or actually just due diligence and responsibility when stepping into production. So who's written the story? Who's telling the story? Who's in charge? Who's sitting around the table making decisions about who is in the story? You know, who have you spoken to in casting the roles? Who have you had in to perform, like to consider for those roles? What are the skill set required for the role? You know, there are. It's not black and white. I certainly understand that there's grey area, but that's where the work is. The work is in the grey area. But it's that's what I mean by it's everyone's responsibility. You know, you've got to do your due diligence to make sure that, you know, that you're consulting with community, that you are talking to the right people to understand, you know, whether that representation or who you've selected to play those roles, you know, fits within the project and the storytelling and your responsibility to the community and for representation.
I suppose it looks like what opportunities are available to people who are from these sort of marginalised or underrepresented groups on screen. Like if we're seeing, you know, straight actors playing gay actors being cast in straight roles, like does that ever happen?
Sure. Well, it's not. Sorry, Alistair, you go.
Oh, no. Why? I do find it interesting because I think it's hard to deny that there are some straight actors historically who have had the talent to portray like nuanced gay roles, like Brokeback Mountain, perhaps is like a famous example. But I think it is also a question of like, beyond how do we make the end product the most like moving thing possible, I think it's also looking at the screen industry as an industry. It is a workplace, and I think it does, you know, help to bear in mind who is getting money for these roles. And if it is a thing where if it's, you know, straight people who are in charge of commissioning or directing or whatever, and they just feel more comfortable with straight people on set, even if they're choosing to cash in on a queer narrative, perhaps just to offset, you know, when they're around catering or whatever, they would just prefer to hang out with a straight person. And I think that leads to these structural inequalities where, you know, people are profiting off stories that aren't their own. And I don't think, you know, I think gay performers, I think queer performers are like a bit overdue on getting their money. And, you know, I can agree that Brokeback Mountain is a great film, but I have preferred that two like gay actors get the acclaim, get the kudos that the straight actors in those roles did? Of course.
Mm-hmm. Cool. Thank you.
Just because you can, it doesn't mean you should. Or just it's time for someone else to have a go.
Good point. We've got a good question from Laura Hart, who thanks you all for telling your stories. To know how you see the role of those in power to help make these changes. I might get your response to that one.
Probably speaks to the point that I was making before about that idea of doing your due diligence and taking the time, and it's the job of all of those people who have traditionally been in power to start considering who's sitting at the table, whose stories are you funding, who are you getting in to tell those stories, who are you seeing to be a part of those roles. It's the responsibility. I've been in rooms, in meeting rooms, where the language is we really should include. The language is should. It's beyond talking about what we should do. Those people in power in those rooms need to start talking about what we're doing. Where do we start? I mean, there are so many avenues. There are so many possibilities. But what enacts real change is starting to actually fund and get behind people who are telling stories that are not the normative things that we have seen on our screens for 100 years. I'm a part of the Casting Guild of Australia, and I'm actually a co-chair of a board for inclusivity. So, and we've been running for a year now, and we're even just starting with talking to people like on an education basis of the language you use, talking about who can be, who should be in rooms, who should be represented, and avenues to help production companies and studios and networks actually sort of how to go about this sort of change or this necessary visibility or inclusivity.
I think this ties in nicely to some new commissioning guidelines that were announced just this week by the ABC. I do work for the ABC, so just declaring my conflict of interest there. So they announced diversity and inclusion commissioning guidelines for screen content to better reflect and represent more diverse faces, voices, cultures and stories, with the idea of nothing about us without us. And as a general rule, externally produced series must be either about underrepresented communities or experiences, or include at least one main cast member who is an Indigenous Australian or from a culturally or linguistically diverse background, someone who lives with a disability, or someone who identifies as LGBTQIA+. And production companies must also demonstrate representation of these communities among key staff, such as writers, producers and directors, and at least half of the main cast and crew must be women or people who identify as gender diverse. So this is like pretty massive, from the ABC side of things. And interestingly, Courtney Gibson, who she's a Facebook friend, but she's the former CEO of Screen New South Wales and has had numerous senior roles in TV and commissioning bodies. She posted in response to this ABC announcement that the new guidelines end the idea of cultural consultancy and instead create authentic authorship. What difference do you think these guidelines will make?
Massive. It's a start. I mean, to have those kinds of, to have that sort of mandated and to have it, I mean, similarly in a way that they do in the United States, there is actually guidelines for inclusivity and representation. I don't know as far as gender diversity goes, but certainly in regards to people of color and cultural diversity. So, I mean, for that to be embraced by the ABC, which is remarkable, to see that sort of roll out, and it will cause effect throughout the whole rest of media, because as we start supporting people being a part of this industry of different experience, people gain experience, full stop, and you'll see that sort of perpetuate and affect the industry rolling forward. Only when people start seeing themselves represented, be it as filmmakers or people on screen, does that 5-year-old child get to see themselves on screen and see that there is a place for them? Does that young transgender kid get to see themselves on screen, see that there's a place for them, and so therefore perpetuate more visibility?
Cool. And Bee and Alistair, with that idea of cultural consultancy that has sort of happened in the past as opposed to representation on the actual team, has that been problematic? Like, I can see that's coming from a good place, but what is the sort of the issues with that?
I really like the sound of the guidelines. I hope they do work, because there's been Indigenous protocol guidelines for years, but I talk about it, and a lot of white producers I know still don't understand what I'm talking about. And I'm like, that's concerning. But with these new protocols and whatnot, I like the fact that a diverse human can walk into a space and feel like they're a little bit more comfortable knowing that they've got these guidelines to fall back onto. I've always been sometimes I'm the only black fella in the room. Sometimes I'm the only woman in the room. Sometimes I'm the only young person, like younger than 40 in the room. And I'm like, I'm sick of being the only person in that space with no backup, you know? So it's nice to know that somebody at a top level is making these executive decisions to help us put a foot in the door and help us be confident, you know. All these white cis males are bloody running the show. I want a bit of a taste of the cake too. I want to walk with a bit of, you know, bit of strut in my stride and that. I want to be confident. And I feel like something like this that allows not only myself, but those other young fellas looking at us, you know. Because I'm doing this for me, but I'm also doing this for the young fella looking up at me, you know. I've got a little 8-year-old foster sister, and I want her to feel like she can do anything. I never thought that I'd walk onto a film set, let alone be making films, like far out. But that's just me. And in regards to consultancy and like authorship, you know, I want authorship. I want black fellas to stand up. I want queer folk. I want everyone that ticks those diverse boxes and everything. I'm not a fan of the boxes, but anyway, we've got to tick them sometimes. But I want everyone to feel like they have the guts to do that and have a safe space to do that, you know? And the more we talk about it, the more we make noise about it, I think it just allows other young, radical young people to come up and say, hey, you know, I want a piece of the cake too. And then it's taking away from that one cis white fellow who's been running the show. It's like, no, you don't get to tell this one story. We get to tell it the way that we want it, you know. And I think that's strong and authentic in oneself, you know. That allows us to keep that storytelling going. You know, it's so important. Yeah. I feel like I'm rambling, but
no. And Alistair, with your experience working in the media and storytelling, like, have you ever found you've been in a position of consultancy as opposed to authorship when it should be more in the authorship direction?
I think definitely. I think while the idea of a sort of a cultural consultant or a diversity consultant comes from a good place, I think a lot of productions are just scared of getting cancelled on Twitter, and they are approaching a consultant with something that they want to just confirm. There's a confirmation bias. I think they have the power to choose the consultant that they want to approach. So already there is a weird power dynamic where if that is your job, for example, you're in a position of wanting to maybe play ball more than you do because that's your job and that's the only way you're going to get more work. Whereas I think if you have diversity within actual power roles which happen throughout the production all the way to on set, it's not like you can't compartmentalize discussions of bigotry or power structures to a day in pre-production or whatever, and then think that you're immune. And then when someone on Twitter criticizes you for really messing up a casting choice, you posting a picture of you in a room with a diverse person being like, no, we talked to this person, they said it was fine, months before that decision actually occurred. I think there is, or certainly I'm very excited by these changes to the guidelines, because while there are lots of fantastic consultants who have worked in like a consulting position, I do feel that a lot of the times it is a role that productions begrudgingly engage with and just as readily dismiss because they think they've dealt with the diversity issue.
Thanks, Alistair. Warner Ward makes a good point. I think it sort of talks about people in power not being able to see beyond their own privilege when making decisions. along these lines. And Warner says we cannot have conversations about, straight people playing gay roles or cis people being cast in trans and gender diverse roles without talking about the systems of power that oppress these minority groups on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's right. And I think that it is why important that we have guidelines that, make sure that people, production companies, networks, commissioners are accountable. And I think guidelines like this are a step in the right direction. I might just have a look at some other comments just to see if I've missed anything as we've been chatting away.
It is interesting, Alistair, that idea of confirmation bias, like that, in the times that I'm sure we've all been consultants in groups, and you kind of feel like you're a mascot and you kind of rolled out into space. And enter a diverse person who said that, that creates validation to our whole production because they're in this space, So the idea of authorship and actually mandating that and creating those guidelines is so exciting.
Totally. I might just give a shout out to a few films that are screening as part of the Mardi Gras Festival that do a good job of authentic and inclusive casting. Haven't seen these films, but they sound really interesting. One is No Ordinary Man. So a groundbreaking film reckons with the complicated legacy of jazz musician Billy Tipton as his story is reclaimed and performed by trans artists. A film called Rurangi, starring, written and produced by members of New Zealand's queer, Maori and gender diverse communities. This touching dramedy is about the power of embracing one's identity in all its forms. And another film called Under My Skin, an insightful, heartfelt and compelling film featuring a very modern love story and a non-binary experience as portrayed by non-binary actors. Have you folks got your list of films to see for the festival yet?
I'm certainly very excited to see Under My Skin, which I believe has Liv Hewson in the lead role, who's a fantastic non-binary performer who people may know from Santa Clarita Diet. And I will confess, I know them as a friend. So I definitely am very excited to see that. They're a wonderful performer.
Good one. What about you, Lucky and Bee?
No, I'm pumped about Under My Skin too. And of course, Ordinary Man is something I'm really excited to see. So very, very exciting to start seeing, trans people telling these stories. It's very exciting for me.
Yeah, I've been saving up for tickets. I'm getting all this.
Awesome. It's been wonderful talking to you all. Are there any final thoughts on this issue of inclusive and authentic casting before we wrap up?
I'd just like to say I'm available if you want to hire me.
We're all available. We're all available as mascots at any available opportunity. I'd just like to thank Mardi Gras and Queer Screen for having us here today. It's just so exciting to engage in this kind of a conversation and have people make comments on this and ask these questions. And thank you, Mon, so much for your thoughtful questions today. And lovely to meet you guys again. And
absolutely.
Freshly.
Totally. How about you, Bee?
No, I'm happy to be here. I'm cheering that more of these conversations are happening. I think they're long overdue. They're long overdue. We've been needing to do this for years. So just thank you, to Queer Screen and Mardi Gras and all you mob, to Mon, Lucky and Alistair. It's lovely to see your faces again. And hopefully we can kick some butt in this regard, be a part of the noise.
Awesome.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Lucky, Alistair and Bee. Thank you to everyone who's been part of this conversation today all around the country. Have a wonderful Mardi Gras Film Festival and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, mates. Thanks all the people watching.
Bye.
That you're listening to us. Bye.